I would like to salute the Pontifical Gregorian University, the alma mater of John Weingards, the founder of the Weingards Institute, who received his Ph.D. here. In her 2018 book, Sacred Stimulus, Jerusalem in the Visual Christianization of Rome, Galit Nogabanai demonstrates that artists use images of Jerusalem to help Christianize Rome. Here I further propose that the architects who designed the monument over Peter's tomb inside Old Saint Peter's Basilica in Rome mirrored the monument over the Holy Sepulchre inside the Anastasis Church in Jerusalem. This ivory pyx is thought to illustrate the altar area of the Anastasis Church in Jerusalem, also called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This ivory reliquary box, without question, illustrates the altar area of Old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. I submitted my abstract for this paper last year, long before Pope Francis issued a call for more historical evidence in order to reinstate women deacons. It turns out that the ancient artifacts I was going to use in my paper also answer Pope Francis's call. Ancient Christian art proves women took a far greater role in ministries and the liturgy than previously thought. Yes, Christian women were present at church altars, and the altars had crosses on them. So why is art so important? Paul Bradshaw, University of Notre Dame professor of liturgy, points out that virtually no liturgical manuscripts have survived from the first 7 centuries. Given this long gap in the written record, these artifacts provide precious windows through which we can see the early Christian liturgy as it was once performed. These 3 artifacts are, to my knowledge, the 3 very oldest to portray people at the altar table of a real church. These 2, the ivory reliquary box and a huge sarcophagus front, are both usually dated around the year 430, and they are the 2 very oldest. The ivory pyx is the 3rd oldest, dated to the 500s, yet it is the very oldest to portray only one sex at the altar table. It is thought to have been carved in the eastern Mediterranean, probably Palestine. After that, its provenance is uncertain until it appeared at an auction in Paris in 1906. Here we see a tripod table, a gospel book on it, and a big lamp hanging above. A cross is on the back. This altar area is usually identified as that of the Anastasis Church, partly because the round shape of the pyx evokes the Anastasis Rotunda, but also because other artifacts similarly represent the Anastasis Shrine, which was over the cave of the Holy Sepulchre inside the Rotunda. For example, both the ivory pyx and a pewter ampoule made a century later in Jerusalem and today in the Monza Cathedral Museum depict spiral columns holding up a 3-sided canopy. Both also depict 2 women carrying censers. The ampoule portrays them as the 2 Marys approaching the shrine over the Holy Sepulchre with an angel opposite, as if about to tell the women that the Lord had risen. The pyx portrays the 2 women with censers approaching the altar itself. Around the back of the pyx, the sculptor carved 3 more women in a procession to the altar, each with her arms raised. Russian Orthodox art historian Alexei Lidov says, the arms raised pose is interpreted in iconographic studies as a liturgical one. During this era, the clergy wore everyday clothes, which only over time became clerical fashion. Yet hanging from each woman's waist is a narrow strip of doubled cloth. According to Alexei Lidov, this cloth, sometimes fringed, sometimes with delicate stripes at the end, later was called a maniple in the West, but in the East, the encheiron, literally handy, a white handkerchief hanging at the girdle of an archpriest, he says, and later called epigonation. Due to its various names over time in both East and West, I call it simply the Eucharistic cloth. Church officiants used it only during the performance of the Eucharist, for example, to wipe excess wine from the rim of the chalice. The rise of priestly insignia is seen in 2 wall mosaics that flank the altar in the Holy of Holies of the Basilica of San Vitale in Ravenna. Dated around the year 550, these mosaics are usually identified as a liturgical procession in the famous Hagia Sophia Basilica in Constantinople, because on the left they portray Emperor Justinian holding the plate for the bread, and on the right, Empress Theodora holding the chalice for the wine. The mosaic that portrays Justinian also portrays Bishop Maximianus, his name over his head, wearing the episcopal pallium, a long white band with a cross on it, worn only during the Eucharist. This decade around 550 is the very first time we see the episcopal pallium on a man in art. On the right are two more clergy, a man carrying a large book and a man carrying a censer. This is the first time that we see a Christian man carrying a censer in the liturgy in art. The opposite mosaic portrays Theodore lifting the chalice and standing between two eunuchs on the left and 7 women on the right. 2 of the women wear the fringed white cloth hanging from their girdles, much as seen on the ivory pyx. A third appears to hold it folded, much as Pope Clement holds it folded in an 11th century wall painting in Old St. Clement's Basilica in Rome, where he also wears an episcopal pallium while he performs the Mass in front of an altar table laden with a chalice and plate. Alexei Lidov contradicts anyone who might argue that the cloth in this mosaic must mean something different just because it is seen with a woman. He says, quote, "Let me remind those who are convinced of the lay provenance of the handkerchief that Theodora with her retinue, as well as Justinian, are presented in San Vitale in a liturgical procession in the sanctuary, both holding liturgical vessels." End quote. Returning to the pyx. The technical name for the beautiful column structure over its altar is a ciborium, sometimes called a baldachin. Today, the vast majority of ciboria over altars are square, and a review of the photos and diagrams in Yelena Bogdanovic's 2017 book, The Framing of Sacred Space, demonstrates that in antiquity the same was true. Almost all ciboria over altars were square. An example of a square ciborium is seen on one of the 2 oldest artifacts to depict people at the altar of a real church. In this case, the second Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, which replaced the first basilica in 415, but burned in 542, after which Justinian built the huge Hagia Sophia, which still stands today. This sarcophagus front was discovered in 1988 in Istanbul, in an underground tomb structure. Johann Deckers and Umit Saradoglu published the find and noted that the column capitals on this carving were the same as the column capitals of the second Hagia Sophia. Based on where it was found, the style of the man's bulb clasp, and the early Christian cross, they dated the carving very tightly around the year 430. They described a ciborium with columns framing the altar table, an early Christian cross set upon it, and curtains pulled back. An arms-raised man and woman flanked the table, with the man on the left and the woman on the right, the same gendered placement seen a century later in the mosaics depicting the liturgy in Justinian's Hagia Sophia. A boy is beside the woman, much as 2 eunuchs were beside Theodora, but otherwise the arms-raised man and woman have almost symmetrical poses, down to the pointing of their feet. Remarkably, the dating around the year 430 corresponds to a conflict that took place in the second Hagia Sophia, a conflict between the imperial princess, Pulcheria, who was regent for her younger brother, and the new patriarch, Nestorius. According to the letter of Cosmas, Pulcheria was accustomed to standing with her younger brother in the Holy of Holies during the Eucharist. Nestorius opposed Pulcheria's custom, and on Easter Sunday in 428 he stopped her at the door of the Holy of Holies. 3 years later, the Council of Ephesus deposed Nestorius and exiled him. We may assume that afterwards Pulcheria resumed her custom. Returning to the square ciborium. This is a 3-dimensional drawing of one. As you can see, artist's perspective means that the 2 closest or front columns appear widest, and that the 2 back columns appear more distant and thus closer together. This would have represented a typical ciborium, although most did not have spiral columns. As we can see, however, the ciborium on the ivory pyx does not appear to be square, but more like a slightly rounded trapezoid, a half hexagon. The placement of its columns appear opposite to what is seen on a square ciborium. The back columns are wider, set against what appears to be the wall of the shrine of the Holy Sepulchre, while its two front columns frame the altar table. The unusual half-hexagon shape of this ciborium, along with its spiral columns, is important, because we see a similar half-hexagon ciborium with spiral columns on the ivory reliquary box that depicts the altar area of Old Saint Peter's Basilica. This ivory box is the second of the two very oldest artifacts to depict people at the altar of a real church. It was discovered in 1906 beneath a Roman-era church near the city of Pola in what is now Croatia. It is often dated around the year 430 because Gala Placidia is thought to be portrayed on one of its sides. Here again we see a half-hexagon ciborium held up with spiral columns, plus a large hanging lamp above an altar table and curtains pulled back. In Old St. Peter's, the 2nd century shrine of St. Peter was on the ciborium's back face. Just as the two front columns of the Anastasis ciborium framed its altar table, so also the two front columns in Old St. Peter's framed a 2nd century stone table that was embedded in the shrine. This is the half-hexagon ciborium plus the beams that continued over to two more columns set against the walls of the apse. It was set on the court of the apse, where it was beautifully proportionate. As on the ivory pyx, the ivory reliquary box portrays women in the liturgy, but in this case, a gender-parallel liturgy such as seen in Constantinople. In 1908, Anton Geniers, the first to publish the box, said that this scene had extraordinary value for understanding the early Christian liturgy. He identified two men and two women with their arms raised flanking the ciborium, and, beneath the ciborium, a man and a woman on either side of the mensa del altare, as he called it, the altar table. Virtually all subsequent art historians have agreed 3 men are on the left and 3 women on the right. Geniers himself did not recognize the 6 famous spiral columns sculpted on the ivory, but other scholars soon suggested that they were the very same 6 spiral columns seen today in the galleries of the modern St. Peter's. That they were the same was confirmed in 1941, when the Vatican excavated beneath the modern basilica's high altar. At the bottom of a stack of medieval altars, Vatican excavators discovered the 2nd century shrine, which they believed was the shrine dedicated to Peter near the site of his martyrdom in Rome. 4th century architects had built Old St. Peter's Basilica around this shrine, which was the focal point of the whole basilica. Both Jerome in the late 300s and Gregory of Tours in the late 500s had reported that Peter's tomb was beneath the altar in Old St. Peter's Basilica, and the excavators discovered a stone tomb below. The shape and size of the 2nd century shrine matched what was carved on the ivory, down to the arched niche seen behind its stone table. Engelbert Kirschbaum, one of the Vatican excavators, later wrote that the scene on the ivory was, quote, so striking, even in its details, as to confirm conclusively its interpretation as the Constantinian apse in St. Peter's. End quote. Geniers had speculated, could the man and woman at the altar table be participating in a ceremony of the sacrament of matrimony? In the next decades, other art historians followed his suggestion. Others have since proposed that they might be mother and son. Some people have suggested that they might be venerating the cross in the niche behind the altar table. But in 1928, the famous Vatican specialist, Joseph Wilpert, entirely rejected that suggestion, saying, quote, in St. Peter's Basilica, the cross was not venerated in such a pronounced fashion as depicted in this scene. End quote. The reason is that Old St. Peter's Basilica did not have a relic of the true cross, and thus such veneration did not occur there. Other art historians have pointed out that the woman was sculpted raising some kind of container, perhaps a pyx or a bowl. If she had been a man from the beginning, she almost certainly would have been identified as a priest raising the chalice. The Vatican excavators took almost 10 years to write their final report, yet never mentioned in it that earlier scholars had identified a woman at this altar. Instead, they tried to move the altar away from the woman. They proposed that there must have been a portable altar table, and that therefore the ciborium must have been a 20-foot by 20-foot square, which they illustrated like this. Vatican excavator Engelbert Kirschbaum later explained that a square ciborium's overhead ribs would intersect in the middle of the square, and the lamp would hang from that midpoint, over empty floor, 10 feet in front of the 2nd century shrine and its stone table. The altar would have been under the lamp's light, he said, and concluded, quote, "We have to suppose a portable altar table." I discussed this fabrication in my new book, Mary and Early Christian Women, Hidden Leadership. But in short, the ciborium was not square. There was no portable altar. The lamp hung above the 2nd century shrine and its stone table, the focal point of the entire basilica. The half-hexagon ciborium over Peter's tomb with the shrine at the back and the half-dome above reflected the image of the half-hexagon ciborium at the Holy Sepulchre, with the dome of the rotunda above. The architects of Old Saint Peter's appear to have reproduced the architecture of the famous Anastasis shrine, thereby visually invoking the sacral power of Jerusalem in Rome, and also symbolically linking Peter's tomb to Christ's. Worthy of consideration is the possibility that the gender-parallel liturgy seen in Old St. Peter's Basilica suggests that not only the architecture of Jerusalem was sacred in Rome, but also Jewish ritual tradition was. Philo of Alexandria described the 1st century gender-parallel ritual of Jews, whom he called therapeutae. He said some were near Alexandria, but that they were also in other areas. He described their all-night ritual with 2 leaders, a man who represented Moses and a woman who represented Miriam. Their ritual invoked the temple in Jerusalem with an altar table, libation, bread, and priests. Joni Taylor, in her study on the therapeutae, says, quote, "Both men and women saw themselves not only as attendants or suppliants, but as priests in this temple." End quote. Philo also said their ritual had 2 choirs, one male and one female, who sang all night and when the sun rose lifted their arms. This is astonishingly similar to what we see on the ivory, because the 4 arms-raised men and women have open mouths, as if singing, a male choir and a female choir. Remarkably, the Mass for which Old St. Peter's Basilica was most famous was also all night, the annual all-night Mass that commemorated Peter. The ivory sculptor, thus, may have captured the singing men and women raising their arms at the very moment during the Mass that the sun rose. Affirming that the liturgy we see here in Old St. Peter's Basilica indeed could have had its roots in the Jewish traditions of the therapeutae, Eusebius of Caesarea in the early 300s wrote that the meetings of the therapeutae, including their rituals and separate places for men and women, were still popular in the churches of his time. We have no reason to doubt Eusebius. Archaeology further supports his claim. For example, the Megiddo Church in Palestine is the very oldest church ruins known in Israel, dated between the years 230 and 305. Megiddo is 15 miles from Caesarea, where Eusebius was bishop. Only the pillar of its stone table has survived, but it is flanked by floor mosaics with women's names on one side and men's on the other. This meeting house was next to a bakery, which suggests that bread may have been shared at this stone table. The gendered mosaics flanking the table suggest these Jesus followers may have had a gender-parallel ritual for breaking the bread. Frescoes in the Christian catacombs of Rome suggest the same tradition of male and female leaders at the offering table. For example, a fresco in the cubiculum of the sacraments in the catacomb of Callistus portrays a man and an arms-raised woman flanking a tripod table laden with a plate and bread. The man is on the left and the woman on the right. The same is seen 2 centuries later in the liturgy above ground in Old Saint Peter's Basilica. Janet Tulloch analyzed other catacomb frescoes that portray male and female pairs with both holding a cup, and the woman raising her cup in the style of the leader. Tulloch says in Christian frescoes, quote, female figures dominate the cup action. She says that this greatly contrasts with pagan funerary art in Rome, where virtually always the man is seen raising the cup as the leader. Here the woman on the right raises the cup above the tripod table, while on the far left, a seated man also holds a cup on the table. This pair, both with cups, resonates with Irenaeus of Lyon's report around the year 170, that in a nearby community of Jesus followers, both a man and a woman performed the ritual of consecrating the wine. Notably, when Irenaeus described the actions of the woman as she consecrated the cup of wine, he used the verb eucharistein, further suggesting that these catacomb frescoes represent Eucharistic ritual. The Latin Didascalia Apostolorum instructed that the Eucharist be performed in cemeteries, and these catacombs were cemeteries. A tradition of women raising the Eucharistic cup, thus, is continually witnessed, from Irenaeus of Lyon's report around 170, to the Christian catacomb frescoes in Rome that portray women raising the cup above the table, to the woman seen raising the cup above the altar table in Old Saint Peter's Basilica, to Theodora, seen lifting the golden chalice in the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople around the year 550. These ancient artifacts, the 3 very oldest to depict people at the altar in real churches, are windows that show us early Christian women at the altar table and performing liturgical functions. Through these windows, we also see that Christians treasured their roots in Israel, not only the architecture of Jerusalem, not only Jewish scripture, but also, it seems, Jewish ritual traditions. The parting of the ways between Christian and Jew was long. The baptismal formula preserved by a Jewish teacher named Paul itself may have been based on a Jewish model. In any case, the earliest Jesus followers appear to have observed it in their assemblies. Both Jew and Greek were leaders in their assemblies. Both slave and free were. So also were both male and female. For, they said, we are all one in Christ Jesus.